What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture, it's a place of history, it's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution
for the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Sorry, y'all. Technology. Good evening, everybody. I hope you are all doing well this evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Schomburg Center's Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. It's my absolute privilege to have you here this evening. My name is Joy Bivens, and I have the joy of serving as the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's conversation, The Politics of Political Repression. I'm coming to you this evening from Harlem, USA. The chat is live, and we encourage you to share where you are and where you're coming to this conversation from. Before turning the program over to the co-curators this evening, I want to thank our featured speakers and presenters for joining us for this very timely conversation. I think that you will find it prescient, and I think that you will find it very much in line with what's happening in contemporary society. To add to that, if you support the work of the Schomburg Center and libraries in general, I hope that you will advocate for us with your representatives, as budgets are always on the line. This is important work, and we need your help to continue to do that. So that's my PSA for this evening, and now I want to turn it over to our co-curators and introduce them. So I have to find myself here. So we have two co-curators who've been working with us for a very long time on conversations in Black freedom studies, Doctors Jean Theo-Harris and Doctors Robin Spencer Antoine. So Dr. Jean Theo-Harris is one of the co-founders of this very program. She is a distinguished scholar and professor of political science at Brooklyn College. She focuses on civil rights and Black power movements and the contemporary politics of race in the United States. She is the author of the widely acclaimed biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. That award-winning book has been adapted into a young adult edition and a documentary for NBC Peacock. Dr. Robin Spencer Antoine, is a historian and professor of history at Lehman College, whose teaching and research explored Black social protests after World War II, urban and working class radicalism, and gender. She is the author of The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther in Oakland, the Black Panther Party in Oakland. I want you to please help me to virtually welcome Dr. Spencer Antoine, who will introduce this evening's panelists and distinguished guests. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Joy Bivens. It's always great to be introduced by you. Thank you for all that you continue to do as leader of the Schomburg Library. It's great to be here in this virtual space. This is our 11th season of Conversation in Black Freedom Studies. Kamosi Woodard and Jean Theo-Harris started Conversations in Black Freedom Studies in collaboration with the Schomburg Center more than a decade ago, to create a space where the public could engage in new works in Black social movement history. With fewer and fewer public spaces to engage with new work in Black history, Conversations in Black Freedom Studies was conceived as a way to hear, to learn, to discuss new work in Black history that can help us think about and learn about the present even more clearly. In many ways, conversation has gotten to chart the rich and expanding field of Black freedom studies over the past decade. And tonight's conversation provides another iteration in that ongoing expansion. Kamosi took on a more emeritus role, and 3 years ago, I was so pleased to step into the role of co-curator. We're happy that the Schomburg has continued this series as one of its educational and public program offerings. We're grateful for Lucien Baskin, who is our outreach and social media coordinator for the series. Please follow us at Schomburg CBFS or at our website, blackfreedomstudies.org. Our next conversation will be online as well on December 7th. The topic is Financing Freedom, Black Women and Economic Self-Determination, where we will hear from acclaimed scholars Tanisha Ford, Jeanette Garrett Scott, and Crystal Moten. Now on to Eugene.
Welcome to our conversation, an urgent one as we consider the politics of political repression and resistance and the role of law enforcement in the Black struggle. We are so delighted, as Robin said, to be together tonight online for this timely conversation at an urgent moment in the world where we are seeing escalating and stark political repression. The goal of Conversations from its beginning 11 years ago has been to give us the history we need to see the way forward, and tonight feels even more urgent than ever. This recording will continue to be available on YouTube, so please feel free to share it with people who might be interested in catching up. I am so delighted and honored to introduce tonight's panelists. Their books are available in the Schomburg shop, both online, and we will be putting that link in the chat, as well as in Harlem. So welcome. Lerone Martin is the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor in Religious Studies and Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University, and the author of The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, How the FBI Aided and Abetted the Rise of White Christian Nationalism. Charisse Burden-Stelly is an Associate Professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University and the author of Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism. I know, right off the press, in the United States. And Adam Elliott-Cooper is a researcher in social sciences at Greenwich University, and he stayed up late to be with us, and the author of Black Resistance to British Policing. Welcome. So where we want to begin tonight is where you began. So maybe each of you can tell us briefly how you came to this research topic, what concerns or commitments or questions or experience guide your work. And Lerone, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. I came to this project in some ways accidentally. I started off wanting to follow up my first book and to talk about religious radio. And two important things happened at that time. The first was a colleague of mine by the name of Bill Maxwell published a book on the FBI surveillance of African-American writers. And he passingly told me in the summer of 2014 that maybe I should look into the FBI being interested in Black religious radio broadcasters. Later that summer, Michael Brown was murdered, and I talked to a number of pastors in the area. I was teaching in St. Louis at the time at Washington University in St. Louis. And a number of pastors shared with me that the FBI had contacted them requesting assistance to help the FBI make sure that St. Louis and the broader region didn't explode into a riot. And that got me thinking, how long has the FBI been seeking pastors out for partnership as opposed to just surveillance? So I began to make Freedom of Information Act request, which ended up in a lawsuit suing the Department of Justice and the FBI for FBI files on the Reverend Billy Graham. And that is how the entire project got started. So I pursued this question: how long has the FBI been seeking partnerships with faith communities? And what was the result of those partnerships? And that is what got the book going.
So my question, I think, was a simple one. Why does the United States hate Black people? And why does the United States hate communists? And how is that sort of mutual disdain reinforcing? And what are the discursive material and ideological tools that are used to sustain racial capitalism, or what I call capitalist racism in my book, through this sort of mutual disdain that I named the Black Scare and the Red Scare? And related to this, how does the figure of the radical Black or the practice of radical Blackness become a sort of preeminent target of the state? As well as how is Black liberation painted as communist in order to discredit it, and not only just Black liberation in the revolutionary sense, but even the struggle for civil rights and the application of civil liberties that are ostensibly codified in the Constitution, the struggle for that when applied to Black people. And at the same time, how is it, or why is it that communists are sort of positioned as the preeminent race traitors, or, excuse my language, nigger lovers? And why does this make them even more dangerous, even more reviled, even more sort of disruptive to the social and political order? And so these are the questions that animate my work currently. A broader question dating back to my dissertation that sort of started this quest was simply, why are there very few sort of Marxist political economists in Black studies? And that question opened up a whole host of other questions that led me to Black Scare, Red Scare, and thinking about the intersections of anti-Black racial oppression and anti-radicalism broadly, but specifically anti-communism after 1917.
Wow, that's fascinating. So I guess I might say two things. One thing a little bit personal, one thing more kind of historical or maybe contextual for people not familiar with the British context. So I guess I first became interested in questions of policing, not when I was doing any kind of formal academic study, but between my master's and my PhD, I had no plans on doing a PhD. I was a youth worker. I'm not sure what the equivalent is in the United States. Maybe you kind of call it an organizer or something. But I was running educational projects with young people in an area of East London called Hackney. And I was always really interested in engaging the young people in social or political questions. And I'd try to talk to them about race, and they'd say, "Oh, get off all that black stuff, Adam. You're always talking about that black stuff all the time. It's, steal my head in." I might try and talk to them about class struggle, and they'd say, "Oh, why are you always talking that, trying to get me down, all that class stuff, Adam?" But as soon as I mentioned the police, something clicked. And almost all the young people I worked with had a personal experience, or one of their friends or a member of their family or somebody in their community had an experience of violence or harm or neglect or harassment at the hands of the police. And this became an avenue for talking about asking questions like, well, the role of the police is to protect property. Well, whose property are they protecting? Are they protecting your property? No. Well, whose property are they protecting? And through that, we could have conversations about class struggle, and by extension, of course, questions of racism and Black struggle as well. So for me, policing wasn't necessarily the most important issue facing Black communities or the world, but it was a really useful avenue into having these wider conversations about class struggle and Black politics, which is what I was really interested in. And so while I was a youth worker, this was back in 2010, 2011, a young Black man called Mark Duggan was shot and killed by the police. And this led to a series of urban rebellions, first across North London, then the whole of London, then the whole of England, for around 4 days, in which police stations and shops and streets saw pitched battles against the police, and buildings were set on fire and what have you. And I began organising with a number of different groups to defend the community from the, as you can imagine, violent repression from the state, which responded, in which lots of people were being sent to prison, people's homes were being raided, people were getting beaten up quite badly by the police, and so on and so forth. And it was from there that I started to begin writing about policing, or I should say resistance to policing. And it was from there that I started to think, actually, I can't just be writing, this is 2010, I was writing blogs and stuff, right? And I realized something important is happening here and I want to write about it more formally, and it became my dissertation topic. The second thing I guess that's important about it is that I started to think more carefully about how to understand British racism and British policing. And the reason I found this important was because a lot of the literature on racism and policing comes from the United States. And I wanted to understand Britain. And what I realized was that when I'm dealing with the British state, I'm not dealing with a nation state. Britain isn't a nation state. Britain is an imperial state. And Britain has always been an imperial state. Since it was founded in the early 1700s, it has only ever had colonies. Slave colonies, of course, in the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas, later colonies in parts of Australia, where it had its white settler colonies, and New Zealand as well. Its indirect colonies across the African continent and South Asia and what have you. And of course, maintaining the largest empire the world had ever known at this time required a great deal of two things: racism and policing. And so in understanding that larger imperial context to British policing, where the bulk of British policing has taken place across its broad colonies rather than, of course, on the British mainland, I think it helped me to better understand both British racism and also something hopefully we can return to, which is crucially a history of Black resistance to British racism, which is always international.
Thank you. What a great start. So this is the part of the program where you get to teach us something. And so if you could each give us a window onto your work, onto the political repression you detail of the Black freedom struggle and the role of law enforcement in that. And again, you would think I would know how to do this. It's so many years in, but no. So this is where you get to teach us something. Give us a window onto your work, onto the role of political repression as you detail it in the Black freedom struggle, the role of law enforcement. And Charisse, let's start with you.
Sure. So part of what I look at in Black Scare, Red Scare is the way that anti-communism is not just it's not reducible to what we call McCarthyism, which we also McCarthyism is actually a very comparatively short period. It's 1951 and 1954. And I could say a little bit more about McCarthyism a little bit later, but essentially looking at anti-communism as a mode of governance that is participated in by all three branches of government. So the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches, something that is top-down, both top-down and bottom-up, and something that has its iterations at the federal level as well as the state and local levels. And so this requires a tremendous amount of coordination, of societal self-regulation, of both authoritarian and ostensibly, democratic practices that are ultimately used to maintain the status quo. And so policing becomes something that is embedded in the US state as such. Some argue that this goes back as far as the Alien and Sedition Acts, right, of 1798. So virtually from the United States founding, it's used the state as a policing apparatus to discipline radicalism and Blackness, because as we know, the Alien and Sedition Acts were meant to sort of target radicalism from the French Revolution, but also from the Haitian Revolution. And there was a deep fear about slave owners coming from Haiti to the mainland of the United States. And then when they brought the enslaved with them, those enslaved Africans from Haiti radicalizing mainland Black enslaved. And so there we see, again, a confluence of a fear of Black freedom or Black struggle for freedom, as well as a fear of radicalism. Now, my book looks at the period between World War I and the early Cold War, which I think is another important intervention, because we typically speak about like two Red Scares, so which is the Palmer Raids moment of 1919, and then the period of McCarthyism, 1951 and 1954. But really, what I try to mark out is a sort of a long array of a Red Scare, because we also have like a 1939 to 1941 moment. We also have moments throughout the 1920s and 1930s. And it's not to make a sort of, make a argument, a transhistorical argument, but rather to think about what are the striking continuities in the sort of disciplining of radicals, whether it be labor militants, people, Black people or other racialized people struggling for rights and recognition, whether it be those struggling for economic democracy, internationalists, anti-colonialists, and there's a similar discourse that's used to discredit, discipline, and criminalize all of these forms of militancy and insurgency. And as I'm sure Lerone could speak to better than I, J. Edgar Hoover is very central, and the Bureau of Investigation and later the Federal Bureau of Investigation are very central in conflating criminality and dissent, and conflating sort of counterintelligence and national security. And so these different conflations are very important to, again, maintain what I would call a racial capitalist status quo, but also to create these, what I call interaction metaphors, or these slippages between these different forms of militancy that are considered anathema by the state. So a quick example of this is Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is not a communist, but Marcus Garvey is red-baited. And the Universal Negro Improvement Association is constantly accused of having sort of Bolshevik influence or Bolshevik infiltration. And in fact, the first sort of Black agents who worked for the BI were used to infiltrate the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African Blood Brotherhood. And there was constantly this discourse about West Indians being susceptible not only to Garvey's influence, but also to communist influence. And so this is what made the UNIA a parallel and mutually constitutive danger to the CPUSA and to communist and socialist movements. And so the upshot is that you don't have to be a communist or socialist, but if you are an anti-communist and you are a racialized person or a colonized person, you're effectively using tools to undermine your own liberation struggle, because anti-Black racial oppression and anti-radicalism, especially anti-communism, are so deeply they deeply inform each other over time. And so I'll stop there. I think I'm over my time, but yeah.
That's really interesting. And I think I see some interesting overlaps as well with some of my research interests, because particularly thinking about the context of Britain also kind of had its Red Scare. But it didn't have its Red Scare, importantly, on the British mainland. It had its Red Scare across its empire, right? It's the fact that communist influence was considered to be one of the key threats to the stability of the British Empire, which, of course, in many ways was not far from the truth. And so, as an imperial state, Britain attempting to maintain its control over its colonies, one of the things it had to do was identify the ways that not only were ideas such relating to Garveyism and other forms of national liberation gaining hold across many parts of its empire, but crucially as well, communist and socialist ideas as well. And I think one of the reasons this is important is because Britain likes to portray itself as being this place where things like red baiting and political repression don't take place. Crucially, of course, Britain is somewhere where racism doesn't take place, right? Racism is this crass thing that happens over in America. It used to happen in South Africa, but everything's kind of fine now, I reckon, right? But of course, in Britain, we don't do race, we do class, right? We do class, we're very comfortable with class, we're so comfortable with class that we still have the dying vestiges of the feudal system still as our official heads of state, right? And I think the reason that one of the reasons it's able to do this is because Britain exports its racism, right? So it does its racism across its colonies, or for most of its history, it has. And so one of the things that I was interested in doing in this work is thinking through the different kinds of anti-colonial organizing and thinking that came to the centre of empire, that migrated to Britain in significant ways as people from Britain's colonies migrated to the centre of empire in significant numbers in the post-war period. And one of those people was a man called John Lerone. And he wrote this really interesting essay called "We Did Not Come Alive in Britain." And what he says in this article is that the dominant narrative is that people from the Caribbean, or Britain's colonies in Africa or Asia, came to Britain and were surprised to experience prejudice or bigotry or whatever it might be. And he said that this isn't the story for most migrants. For many of these migrants, actually, they'd already experienced British racism through the ways that British capitalists owned the mines and the plantations, the docks and the mills. They'd already experienced British racism through the systems that controlled the courts and the police, who collected the taxes and administered other forms of bureaucratic governance. And so their understanding of British racism was already fundamentally linked to capitalism via imperialism and linked to state power via these forms of colonial institution making. And what was required, therefore, was, upon arriving in Britain, was instead an understanding of racism for working class white people, right, for whom they had these colonial subjects had very little, if any, contact with in their entire lives. And this was needed, particularly for those who were coming from a Marxist tradition, who were very often required a new analysis to better understand why it is their co-workers and their neighbours who were the same class as them appeared to be had to align their interests through, of course, forms of nationalist racism with the bosses and the state bureaucrats. And I think one of the things that's really important about this is that both British racism is always international, but Black Britain is also always international as well, and therefore Black struggle is as well. And one of the things I did was go through lots of the different Black power movements, newspapers and other forms of literature that took place in the 1970s and 80s, and appreciate how international their politics always was, and how they were constantly linking up and thinking through the anti-colonial movements, the workers' movements in other parts of the decolonising world during this time, and how informative this was to their own localised political struggles.
You know, there are definitely connections with my colleagues here. One of the interventions that I try to make is that white Christian nationalism was a bedrock of American national security. That J. Edgar Hoover is the architect of the modern national security state. And he saw Christianity, a white Christian nationalism, as a centerpiece of what made America America, especially against the kind of communist threat or subversive threat that Charisse mentioned. And as Charisse also mentioned, this idea of communism is a huge receptacle for J. Edgar Hoover. It is essentially, as Charisse said, anybody who seeks to make structural change in American society, Hoover will dismiss that person as subversive and being communist. And how Hoover constructs this national security state is primarily by baptizing the FBI in a white Christian nationalism. Throughout my research, when I was making Freedom of Information Act requests about various different activities within the FBI during Hoover's reign, which uncovered that Hoover had FBI agents sign an employment pledge. This pledge was a law enforcement pledge, which said in part that FBI agents would be both ministers and soldiers for America. There were FBI worship services for FBI agents. There were FBI spiritual retreats for FBI agents as well. And all of this was a way to cultivate within the FBI this idea that FBI agents were Christian soldiers and that they were going to police America to keep America safe and Christian. And this definition of Christian for Hoover was very narrow. It was about male headship. It was about maintaining America's capitalist order. And anyone who sought to challenge that, especially Black freedom fighters, he was able to depict them as going against not just America, but actually fighting against God. And so what I tried to argue in the book is to show that this entire structure of the modern national security state has at its core a certain kind of white Christian nationalism, which allows FBI agents to see their activity not just as federal workers, but as people who are actually engaged in a cosmic existential battle for the soul of the nation.
Thank you. And the overlaps, as I can imagine everybody listening at home, right? There's so many overlaps tonight that we can get to. So our panel is unfolding at a time of global warfare that has included widening instances of political repression and what some scholars are calling a new McCarthyism, although Charisse, I think maybe you could give us a better word for that. Scholars have so much to offer in this moment. What lessons for our times can be drawn from the histories of political repression and resistance that you tell? And Adam, let's start with you.
That's a great question. I mean, yes, we are facing a great deal of repression at this time, and I mean, particularly in the context of Europe, which is not unconnected from other forms of government repression. We're seeing a conflation, and I guess it's been mentioned already, of the moral panics or the forms of repression against criminalized categories of people and political dissidents and political threats, right? So the specter of the gangster is, of course, fundamentally linked to an anti-black racism, is very much tied up with the kind of forms of repression we're seeing against the movement for Black lives, which has, of course, gained in popularity enormously over the last few years. The anti-Muslim racisms, which have been hugely important for, I guess, reaffirming state power in countries like Britain and the United States as well, of course, is fundamentally linked to the foreign policy of these nations, and of course has been mobilized enormously in the current context of the repression taking place in Gaza and other parts of occupied Palestine. And finally, of course, the spectre of the migrants, right? Reaffirming the power of bordering, both in the context of trying to create things such as Fortress Europe, with people drowning in the Mediterranean, as well as the English Channel, across the borders of the United States and elsewhere, but crucially as well, framing the migrant problem as a threat to the sanctity and stability of places like Britain and the United States, rather than a predictable consequence of climate breakdown, climate catastrophe, economic underdevelopment, war, and other forms of state and non-state violence. And I think it's that in that context, I kind of go back to a conversation I had with some of the Black Power activists that I spoke to for this research, who migrated to Britain from the Caribbean in the 1960s and 70s. And they said to me, Adam, you young people, you keep talking about all this abolition stuff. You're talking about abolition. When we were your age, we weren't talking about abolition. We were talking about global revolution. And I wasn't really sure how to respond to that at first. But then I realized that in those days in the 60s and 70s, there was a Cold War raging, right? And it was hot across the global South. And people were fighting for what they thought could be a very, very different world. Today, we're not in that same kind of world, right? But I think there are still lessons that we can learn, because the thing that we're confronting isn't the kind of McCarthyism or what have you, and other forms of pro-imperial repression, but of course is the militarism of the carceral state, right? And I think of the carceral state as a continuum from the police officer on the corner of every street to the drones and the tanks and the occupations and the invasions, thinking about the carceral state as that continuum. And I think thinking through our global revolution in that in this carceral context, I think it can better enable us to draw those lessons of the past and understand abolition as something which needs to be borderless, needs to be international, and needs to be in solidarity with people across the globe today.
You know, I would only add to that, Brother Adam. I think it's a fairly straightforward point, but an important one. And that is that I think all of our books show that freedom has been a struggle for Black folk across this country. And across this globe. There's a way in which it feels in the US and the UK in particular that there is a narrative that freedom and equality was always inevitable, right? That this was the natural end of American democratic practice. This was the natural end of Western political thought. I think what all three of our books show is that that's not the case, that people of color have had to push and to march and to struggle to have the gains of equal rights that we see today, and continually have to struggle. So I think that's one lesson that I would leave with our audience today, is that the lessons of history are that we should continue pushing forward for freedom and equality, and it's going to be a struggle. It's not inevitable, but those who came before us offer us wisdom, not an exact playbook, but a level of wisdom in which we can take with us and carry with us so we can move into the future, not with luck, but also with hope and strategy from those who went before us.
I suppose I have more of an admonition than a lesson. So like I am not a proponent of the new McCarthyism. I hesitate. Some analogies I think can obfuscate more than they illuminate. Because really we can call this movement Trumanism, because the loyalty oath in the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations was 1947. We could call it Fishism or Dyeism. Those are two committees that preceded like HUAC and the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. You know, we could call it Hatch Actism, which was in 1939, which was passed, right? Another iteration of loyalty oaths. We can call it, the moment of, Palmerism. There was A. Mitchell Palmer, who was trying to, who was not only the sort of architect of the Palmer raids, but was trying to get a peacetime sedition bill passed that was modeled after both the Espionage and the Sedition Acts. And I can go on and on, right? So there are many moments throughout U.S. history. So, the saying goes like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But if we only have one refrain, if we only have one couplet, if you will, then I think everything becomes McCarthyism, or everything becomes COINTELPRO, or everything becomes fascism in a way that can allow us to evade responsibility of what's precisely happening in the present moment, right? And it allows an evasion whereby if it's like, well, this actually doesn't have the dynamics of McCarthyism, therefore it's not so bad, therefore it's okay, right? Or this doesn't have a few characteristics of fascism, therefore it's not fascism, therefore it's not so bad. And we're constantly looking for the atrocities, the most spectacularized moment, as opposed to the broader dynamics that are constantly at play, like imperialism, like colonialism, like warmongering and militarism. And so I think part of what we can learn from our predecessors was they were precise and they studied. And so I think that now we have a tendency to use words like racial capitalism or whatever in ways that don't, that allow us to not do the deep work. But I think, for example, if you look at a petition like We Charge Genocide, which I talk about in my book, a 1951 petition, they were meticulous in documenting what exactly do we mean by genocide? What has happened, right? And there's like case after case after case after case. And so I think we need to get back into the habit of doing that deep sort of rigorous work, organizing and study and political education, right? And keeping up our revolutionary optimism. And again, something that we also can learn from history is all of those things were maintained through organizations. There's a weird attack on belonging to an organization in this moment. We must join and belong to and fight to sustain movement and revolutionary organization.
Thank you. Now on to you, Robin.
It's been wonderful to hear this conversation, especially to think about how you're each giving us a way of understanding where we are today in really, really rich and illuminating ways. When I say where, I mean, I think the geographical breadth of what we're discussing is really, really important. And with that in mind, I have to call out all of the people from the chat who are calling in and revealing roots that are global and diasporic. We have people, of course, from the boroughs of New York, the Bronx and Brooklyn. I also saw some folks there chiming in from the Caribbean, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, people who with roots in Dominica, people who are really coming and testifying in the chat to the ways in which the histories you reveal are also part of their present day. So I really, really appreciate that. I want to remind the audience to start putting your questions and comments into the comment box on YouTube so we can share that later in the program when the panelists will be able to respond to you most directly. And I want to ask the panelists to say that our audience is filled with teachers and learners of all kinds. Many people are teachers in their families, in their communities, in their collectives, in ways that belie any kind of teaching credentialization or anything like that. And then, of course, we have the many teachers who are in the classrooms in this country fighting for space and for oxygen to bring forth a history that is rich and revelatory and accurate. So with those teachers in mind, can you let us or introduce us to one individual or one event that you have encountered in your research that you think more people should know about? Bring us someone new, something new, or give us a new insight into something that we already think we know about. I will start with you, Lerone.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'd present the FBI's campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. as something that people know about, but I'd like to encourage people and invite people to rethink it. What I was able to discover is not just the surveillance, the bugs, the microphones, and following King around, but also the network which allowed this. And I've talked to Jean about this a great deal. The FBI got permission from Attorney General Robert Kennedy to begin this campaign on Martin Luther King Jr. And it was a campaign that was involved with all branches of government. It wasn't as if J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI went rogue, that this was a campaign that involved all levels of authority. And one thing that I was able to illuminate in the book is their recruitment of African-American clergy also in this effort against Martin King. One in particular was by the name of Elder Lightfoot Solomon Mashaw. And Elder Mashaw was a leading religious broadcaster of the day. He was the first minister, black or white, to have his own television show beginning in 1947. He broadcasted over radio for CBS radio beginning in 1929. And the FBI recruited him and used their intel to help frame and discredit Martin Luther King Jr. So I think, that campaign is so important, not just because it helps reframe who King is, right? We're presented with a King today that's very sanitized and anesthetized, right? But it allows us to see how dangerous his ideas were to the state power at that time. But it also helps us to see the later strategies the Bureau would use and continues to use today to frame protesters and freedom fighters. And these are tactics that were shared with the UK over in Kew Gardens, where near dear brother Adam is. Archives show that there is an exchange program between Scotland Yard and the FBI. And so they're engaging in this network of exchanging ideals about how to go after freedom fighters. So I'd like to just present and encourage our listeners to rethink the campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. as a much broader campaign, not something that was driven by a rogue FBI, but something that was driven by state power, and something we have to remember today as the FBI does its best to get us to forget that King was once considered radical and a danger to this nation.
So I think that I'll just talk about the Racial Conditions Report, which was a report that was commissioned by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI in 1942, was published in 1943, and it was essentially a way of surveilling Black protest and basically painting Black protest as foreign-inspired or communist-inspired, or in some cases, in league with the Japanese because of the long history of sort of Black sympathy to Japan. This is prior to World War II, right? Specifically because, they whooped the Russians in 1905, and because they represented the colored, right? The colored world rising up against white supremacy. And so there's a long history from people like Du Bois and Marcus Garvey having a particular sympathy to Japan. But anyway, the Racial Conditions Report, essentially its purpose was to show that any Black descent could be discredited or was a threat to national security or was subversive because of its linkages to these so-called enemies of the United States. And so that's important because what it implies or what it states outright is that even though the agents had shown time and again that what Black people were responding to was their material conditions and their political dispossession, nonetheless, their protests were considered to be more threatening to national security than the white supremacy and exploitation that was causing the unrest, but that also it could be traced to these nefarious sources. And so, again, I think that when we think about surveillance and counterintelligence, the main thing we think about is COINTELPRO, but this report was fully, 20 years before at least the discovery of COINTELPRO and its consolidation. And it had the same types of logics whereby it called for more surveillance of Black organizations. It called for more police force to put down these different race riots and these uprisings. It created a conflation between very disparate organizations like the March on Washington movement, which was an anti-communist movement, basically, and the Communist Party. And so it was a way of conflating all Black protests with some type of adjacency to communism or to subversive influence, and thereby dangerous just by virtue of being participated in by masses of Black people. A very interesting kind of anecdote within that report was the call for surveillance and repression of domestic workers, because ostensibly they were organizing something called Eleanor clubs, right? That because they were organizing for better wages, better working conditions, and to be liberated from white women's homes, that this also had some subversive influence. And so, of course, this caused white households to adopt some type of mass hysteria, thinking that their Black maids were being influenced, having communist influence and inspiration. But it just goes to show that any sort of Black militancy or organizing was so easily red-baited in that there's a very long history of this. And so the racial conditions report is really important in that regard.
I'm going to take us to one of the really important islands of the Caribbean that was a former part of the British Empire, the island of Trinidad, for which, as I'm sure many people here are aware, a very, very illustrious list of Black subversive radicals, Marxist intellectuals, thinkers, fighters, and all the rest have emerged. But one of them, I think, has been far too often overlooked, and her name is Elma Francois. And she was a really fascinating organizer in the 1930s who originally actually migrated to Trinidad from St. Vincent's, I think it was, and originally began working as a domestic worker and began organizing domestic workers in Trinidad in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And as she became a more accomplished organizer, she began working with wider social movements and workers' organizations, including the National Workers' Cultural and Social Association and the National Unemployed Movement. And in the 1930s, as was the case in the United States, there was a serious economic depression in Trinidad. And this, of course, led to people losing their jobs, people lower wages, there being less investment in public infrastructure. And this led to labor militancy across the British Caribbean. And one of the big kind of flashpoints for these uprisings was on the 13th of October, 1937. And the night before this uprising, Elma Francois visited Woodford Square, which was, I guess, a place where lots of people would gather and organize and make big political speeches in Port of Spain, the capital of Trinidad. And in it, she said, she spoke of the movement for land rights against British settlers in Kenya. She talks about protests in Nigeria against colonial taxes being paid to the British by the indigenous people. She talks about the terror of being imposed upon workers' organizations in fascist Germany, as well as the victories being won by working class strikers across England and other parts of Britain. But she also, of course, talks about the troubles and the issues taking place on the doorstep of the people listening to that speech, right? So the hunger, the poverty, the suffering taking place in colonial Trinidad. And the next day, this uprising, the mass strikes that took place led to huge numbers of arrests. And the British sent naval vessels and other warships to Trinidad to repress this uprising, which of course wasn't just about the bread and butter issues that people were facing every day, but of course was a wider movement against colonial injustice, racism, and capitalism as well. And over 500 arrests were made, including of Elma Francois herself, who became the first woman in the island's history to be charged with sedition. The police claimed that her speech had the intent of, quote, causing disaffection among His Majesty's subjects. So when she ended up going to trial, unlike her co-defendants, Elma Francois insisted on representing herself in court and facing an all-male property-owning jury. She used the opportunity to recount how innocent civilians had been killed by the bullets of soldiers and the British police repressing their rebellion. Right, and she made this brilliant speech, which I just want to quote a very small section. She said, and this don't forget, this is 1937 Trinidad. She says, "War clouds are currently hanging over Europe, and political howlers will soon be coming to ask you, the same people who, when you ask for bread, are shot like dogs and given jail sentences, to fight for them. But we will tell them that we will not fight in any war. The only war that we will fight is the fight for better conditions, peace, and of liberty." And so Elma Francois, with this kind of brilliant, I guess, foresight, is seeing the way that the prelude to World War II is going to see large numbers of British colonial subjects and French and other colonial subjects being recruited to come and fight and suffer and kill and possibly die on the battlefields of Europe, to defend not simply British interests, but crucially to defend the British Empire, right? Which was far more concerned with defending its empire from the German Empire than it was, as it likes to tell the world, some kind of humanitarian or anti-racist struggle against German Nazism. And I think Elma Francois' commitment to labour organising, organising women, organising unemployed people, her commitment to anti-imperialism and internationalism, but also her brilliant foresight in understanding and drawing connections between global war, the rise of fascism, political repression, anti-colonial struggle, workers' movements, I think makes her a really important thinker and activist in Black struggle who resisted repression, but I think is far too often overlooked.
Thank you. I feel like the best books give us a new language. They give us new glasses to see things that we're familiar with. They change our vocabulary for the better. They bring new, or I should say new, they bring pre-existing moments in history to our attention and surface them in a timeline that we oftentimes simplify. So I'm excited about your books. I hope that the listeners are out there writing down things that you're saying and committing themselves to picking up the book, ordering it at their local bookstore, checking it out, and requesting it from their local libraries. And I want to turn now to the types of engagements that the audience wants us to have. First of all, to say that you brought out some Trinidadians in the last commentary. So Trini is in the chat. And I want to start off maybe with a question about the how. How did you do this work? Talk to us about your methodology a little bit, the archives that governed, that shaped, that you created, that you brought together, that you had to possibly fight to gain access to bring us these important histories. So anyone can jump in.
I'll start really briefly and just say the archive that I built was primarily from the Freedom of Information Act, making FBI requests for FOIA requests for FBI documents, and also from the National Archives. Some FBI documents have been moved over to the National Archives, and so the process was long and drawn out because the FBI may say, yes, that file exists on this particular person, but it's at the National Archives. Then you have to request it from the National Archives, and National Archives has their own process of security clearance and screening. So that is what took a good amount of time for this project. I made my first Freedom of Information Act request in 2014, and the book came out in February of this year. So part of the process was just waiting for documents. And then COVID hit, of course, in that process in time, which slowed things down a great deal. And eventually I just had to stop making requests and just write the book based on the information that I had. But I'm still to this day finally getting requests from the FBI being sent to me. I just got something a week or so ago that I requested all the way back in 2021. So sometimes it takes 12 months, 18 months, 24 months to get documents. So it does take time when you're dealing with these type of state documents.
I should probably come clean and admit that I'm actually not a historian. This book was written when I was a geographer. I now work in political science. I'm kind of just whatever. But and so most of my research wasn't really in archives, and I guess because a lot of the kind of time periods I was looking at were, kind of mid 20th century, and I was mainly looking at resistance rather than repression. I spoke to a lot of people. I spoke to a lot of activists who are still with us, and I spoke to people who knew activists who are no longer with us, and I had a lot of conversations, and I think those were really illuminating and exciting, and I guess a way of kind of doing a bit of history without necessarily, or kind of by accident, because you're kind of talking to people about to try to better understand what's happening today, and you end up learning a huge amount about what happened before.
I am also not a historian, although I did a lot of archival research, but I like to say I'm historically nosy. So essentially what I wanted for my book was to have sort of 6 artifacts or kind of case studies that permeated throughout the text to sort of show that I engaged in different ways to show the recurrence of the themes of the books, which were like Wall Street imperialism, structural location of Blackness, Black Scare, Red Scare, and then anti-communist governance. So I looked at the prosecution of the industrial workers of the world during World War I, under the Espionage Act, specifically focusing on Ben Fletcher, who was like the one Black wobbly that was indicted. Then I looked at the disciplining and deportation of Marcus Garvey, the several Angelo Herndon cases, starting with in 1932 with his arrest and indictment under the Insurrection Act in Atlanta. I looked at the what's called the Lusk Committee report, or the Revolutionary Radicalism, which was a sort of state level report. I looked at Raycon, and then we charged genocide. And there was just so much. These were things that were constantly recurring in the secondary literature, and I was also finding in the other archives that I visited. I visited like 5 or 6 archives, and that were constantly being brought up by the different sort of actors that I look at. And so that was a sort of the methodology that I used.
Thank you for sharing that. Someone from the audience wants to ask a question, or has asked a question about the contemporary moment. So I'll just read directly. How do you think that organizers today can address the hyper-individualization that is paired with safety and held together by apathy, and the juxtaposition of the violence associated with dissent? And I can say it again, but I think they want us to think about dissent in this moment and the stakes of that, and how one fares as an individual versus the collective, in that moment. So how do you think that organizers today can address the hyper-individualization that is paired with safety and held together with apathy, and the juxtaposition of violence associated with dissent? So if that calls up anything for you, I'm sure they would love to have your thoughts, or if you want to stew on it.
I mean, I think I would just say again, like this is the importance of joining an organization. And it's also the importance of sort of rebuilding movement, right? And again, I know that there's a lot of critique of organizations and a lot of emphasis on things like horizontalism and disruption and et cetera. But I think that what can happen with that is that it's much more easy to move sort of seamlessly in and out in a parachuting way, in an individualist way. But there's a level of sort of ethical commitment that is required to belong to an organization. And I do think that, you know, repression is real, and in a capitalist society when all of our sort of livelihood and longevity is tied to a job, it can be very scary to take stances that are going to cause you to lose your livelihood. But probably in maybe the medium to long term, the alternative is much worse. That is to say, we continue to negotiate like the terms of our immiseration. And so I think that we have to probably get out off of Twitter, X, whatever it's called now, and get like back into like the real world. Because a lot of the debates that we think are sort of important or central on social media actually are not what is not what's happening like in the real world. And you know, I do think that and the importance is to struggle against the contradictions within the organizations and not try to collapse them, right? It's to engage those contradictions and those antagonisms, because it is only collectively our only strength. Those of us who are racialized, exploited, oppressed, etc. Our only strength is in numbers, and in our ability to sort of outlast the oppression. So join an organization.
Thank you. Any other comments on that one? Otherwise, Adam?
I was just going to say something very small, just picking up on something that's already been said, which I think is about social media, right? Which I think does a lot of this kind of individualizing work, right? And focuses either on what I as an individual can say that's like cleverer than thou, or a good takedown of someone else, or calling out this kind of thing, which I think does a lot of this kind of individualizing work. But crucially as well, I don't think social media is very sociable. Right, and that's probably because social media isn't supposed to be sociable. It's supposed to be a platform for our data to be sold to advertising companies, right? It's not supposed to be a platform for us to be sociable. And I think that we can maybe use it for being sociable sometimes, but I think we should always keep it in the forefront of our mind that it is a platform for our data to be sold to advertising companies. And I think if we recognize that, then it's one of the ways in which we can hopefully, not over-rely on this platform, which can often descend into this kind of individualism.
Definitely. Thank you for those comments. Now I have specific questions that our audience members are wanting to ask you as individuals. So I'll start with Adam. Audience member wants to know, in your research, either in the archives or in the interviews or oral histories that you did with movement leaders, did you happen to come across any evidence of British police operations in Trinidad in response to the Black Power Revolution? And they note that the KEW, if I'm mispronouncing, archives are strangely closed on this.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. So I haven't done the archival work on the repression of the Black Power movement in Trinidad. For those who aren't aware, Trinidad got its independence from Britain in 1962, and the Black Power movement kind of emerged after that in the late 1960s, mainly as a movement to remove British capital from Trinidad. So they're a very explicitly Marxist organization. I know there was a great deal of political repression that took place from the Trinidadian government, which Chris Johnson has done some really great work on this. I recommend checking out his great article, The Guerrilla Ganja Gun Girls, which is about a number of women who were involved in I can't remember the name of it. Was called the NUF, the National United Freedom Fighters, which is one of the Black Power groups in Trinidad at this time, who ended up fleeing to Britain, actually. And one of the reasons that so many radical Black people from the Caribbean ended up coming to Britain was because Britain actually considered it to be safer to have them in Britain than having them in the Caribbean, because the States doesn't have the same kind of monopoly on violence in the Caribbean as the British state does on the British mainland, because of the kind of infrastructure they have in Britain compared with its colonies. They could keep far closer tabs on people like Claudia Jones or other people in the National United Freedom Fighters than they could in those colonies. So I know there was certainly a back and forth between the Trinidadian government and the British state, but there wasn't the same kind of overt British involvement, as far as I am aware, that I've seen, in the same way as there was in Grenada, where British were ready to send warships, but basically didn't because the US got there with their helicopters first, right, in the 1980s, or they were sending British troops to Angola following the revolution, and to St. Vincent during its Black Power struggles, and those in far more direct ways. But again, I'm not a proper historian. Check out W. Chris Johnson. He's good on this.
I wanted to shift over to Charisse, who may have a comment, but then I have a question. So the question is, did you go through some of your mentor Gerald Horne's papers at the Schomburg for your research? So can you give us insight into that one?
Yeah, so just quickly on for those interested in like the Black Power uprising, specifically Eric Williams' role in like repressing it, there's quite a bit in his papers that are at UE St. Augustine. And it actually was the United States. He actually threatened the Black Power uprising of 1970 with US intervention. There's actually a warship like off the coast of like Trinidad and Tobago. So anyway, Eric Williams' papers, which I went to for dissertation stuff randomly. Anyway, so Gerald Horne's papers, yes, I have been there and have been texting with him. They're about stuff that's in there, which I don't know if he knew was in there. But they're very sort of fruitful, very rich. I've also read like a ton of his, I think I have like every book he's ever published, honestly. And so I've read obviously a lot of his secondary research. I don't love the way that they're organized. Like, I don't know if he organized them, then donated them or what, but like, I hopefully that there'll be like another round of going through to sort of, make them a little bit more, accessible, because there's a lot of material in there, including like CDs, floppy disks. There's just a lot of stuff in there. So anyway, yes, I have been in his papers, and they are very helpful. But interestingly, a lot of his research is at the Schomburg. Like a lot of the papers he went to are at the Schomburg or at NYU, actually across several archives. But I did find his papers to be helpful.
Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Great connections. And then, Lerone, a question about awareness of or suspicion of state surveillance and repression. Did you find that, did that affect organizing approaches of the organizations or activists in your studies? Did people know, suspect, fear?
Yes, all of the above. People knew, suspected, and feared. I think the suspicion, obviously, what it can do is circumscribe discourse, right? And planning. If you're suspicious of, if I can't trust you, then I may not be willing to share with you my ideas. And so suspicion can shrink this discourse. And there was certainly knowledge. I think Martin Luther King Jr. and others began to realize when Martin Luther King Jr. received this compendium mixtape the FBI sent him about his activities in hotel rooms across the country. I think he realized it was the FBI coming after him in 1964 and 65. Others have now told their stories. Andrew Young, Clarence Jones, and others have told their stories. Ella Baker and others. I think Rosa Parks. I think most people just kind of went and assumed that they were being followed. I think one way that some activists thought about it was, we're not doing anything illegal, so they can spy on us and surveil us all they want. That was the attitude that some people took. Others, I think, were afraid because, as Charisse mentioned, right, jobs, family members, livelihood, a lot of that was at stake. And so most people were aware of this, suspected it. I will add in closing that King was one of the, he drug his foot about acknowledging that he was being surveilled. Clarence Jones, who was his attorney, who lives here in the area in Palo Alto, had mentioned to him, like something was going on and the phone sounded funny. And for a long time, he said that King would say, "Stop it. The FBI's got more important things to do than to be worried about us." So he was a little naive as it relates to that. And I think by 1964, 65, he's very clear what the FBI is doing to him.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. I can say that I've had the opportunity to look at some of the King surveillance documents around the speech breaking, time to break the silence. And it's been sort of astounding to think about the ways in which the conversations behind the scenes and how the documents themselves are a rich archive that say as much about the surveillance state than they say about what they were actually trying to surveil. So it's a very sort of thing to be thinking about using those filters.
That's right, and I think you're absolutely right. I think what you said is really important. I want to say it again. I think the documents tell us a great deal about the state and the FBI, and not so much about the targets of the surveillance. And I think that's important that we realize that we're reading this through the lens and the guise of hundreds of years of colonialism and racism and sexism and so forth and so on. That it tells us a great deal about people who are engaging in surveillance and not always so much about the targets of that surveillance. And I think that's really important.
For sure, for sure. A general question for anyone who wants to answer it. Can you tell us about the tools or practices of law enforcement that you discovered in your research that we may not understand or even know about? Did you find tools and practices of law enforcement? I'm guessing you all, yes, you did. But how can you sort of, I think, address this question in a way that gives us something to take away of an example or a moment?
I've got a little one. I'm trying to think of something that might be of interest to Americans, which isn't some like niche intricacies of British policing. But there is one actually. So there was a guy called Mark Thompson, who was a British colonial administrator. And he played a really important role in helping to, organize counterinsurgency operations. So trying to repress anti-colonial uprisings in places like Malaya was probably his big success. I mean, he claimed it as a success, but of course the people of Malaya got their independence, so who knows, eh? And one of the reasons it was considered a success was because he was able to do two things. The first is he was able to utilize what he referred to as hearts and minds counterinsurgency policing. He said it was just as important, or if anything more important, 2/3 of the conflict, he said, was capturing the hearts and minds of the local population. And of course, we know that if you're fighting a guerrilla war, the reason that insurgents are so effective at fighting guerrilla wars is because they generally have the support of the local population, which of course the counterinsurgency colonizing population does not. And he was brought in as a consultant following his success in Malaya by the Americans to come and advise them in how to fight counterinsurgency in Vietnam. And one of the pieces of advice that he gave the Americans after he eventually quit because they refused to listen to him because they were far more interested in being very gung-ho rather than trying to capture hearts and minds. He said, when a Vietnamese farmer has his cattle shot and killed by the US forces, and he makes a complaint, and he wins that complaint and he receives compensation for it, then I will know we are winning the war. And what he meant by that was that when our systems of governance are considered the legitimate systems of governance, when our avenues for justice are considered the avenues of justice that local people respect and can rely on, then I know we are winning the hearts and minds of the local population. Right. Then I know that effectively we have a form of hegemonic power. We are ruling by consent. And then I will know we are really winning this war, because it means that the local population that the insurgency rely on cannot in the same way rely on the local population for their support, which they need in order to win that guerrilla war.
I only add, in my study, I interviewed a number of retired FBI agents, and I learned things not so much about back then, although I did learn things about like pretext phone calls. The FBI agents would pretend to be American Express and call Robin, we're calling from American Express for fraud alert. We just want to make sure, are you planning on traveling out of town anytime soon so we can protect your account? So they were doing that all the way back in the 60s, these sort of pretext phone calls. And there's a whole FBI manual teaching FBI agents how to make pretext phone calls back in the 50s and 60s. But what I learned about current day stuff, I think was even scarier about techniques that the FBI receives from the NSA, the National Security Agency, using things that they call like a dirt box, which is an apparatus that can put on an airplane, and they can fly over an area and consume all the cell phone data from that particular area. Then they can figure out who's talking to who. And also on a smaller level, something called a stingray, which police departments can use, where they can have a stingray, and it's like the size of a briefcase, in a police car that can do a similar thing. It tricks your cell phone into thinking that it is the cell phone tower. So all your cell phone data goes through to the stingray. And so the police can then figure out who's talking to who from cell phone data. So as Adam said earlier, our social media and the other things that we have, right, are really convenient for surveillance. And I think that I learned that from just interviewing FBI agents during the process of my project.
Thank you.
I mean, I'll just add quickly, like, they are notorious, like, so the FBI in particular, they're notoriously inaccurate and they lie. But it doesn't matter, because the lies become the truth. And the lies become the new basis by which they construct threat. And a lot of those lies are levied for funding and to make things seem more dangerous than they are, or more widespread than they are. But then you want to talk about critical fabulation, like that is like the materiality of like critical fabulation, that because then it becomes truth, right? It becomes the new like effective truth. And but they're not precise, they're not careful, they're really dumb sometimes. But it's just the sheer volume of data, I think, that makes the surveillance effective.
And Charisse, and the crazy thing about that is, even when there is government data that tells us what the actual threat is to the homeland, right, funding still doesn't match up to that. So we know from several government reports that the Senate and others have said it is white nationalist violence that is the major threat to the homeland. But all the funding still goes towards, right, focusing on Muslim populations in this country and Black folk in this country, despite the fact that the data actually says something different. So your point is very well taken about the way the discourse and the narrative is shaped. It supersedes in many ways even the data that comes out that tells us what major threats are.
And this is the point in the program where I can see the end in sight, and I can see the chat full of questions. So I'm just going to throw out a few questions and see what sticks, and give everyone a minute to respond to whatever, I guess, whatever strikes them. So a question about the UK and its double tax agreement with Trinidad and Tobago, and what is that, if you happen to know. A question about being in a surveillance universe and the state of education at universities across the US, Canada, and the UK today around the question of surveillance and repression. and a question about faith-based communities as a target for police apparatus, and any connections that you can make today. So those are three broad questions. We've got three individuals, and I just wanted to put them out there. They'll be there for posterity in the YouTube chat, so don't feel you have to take on everything. But if anything strikes you that you want to comment on from any of those three provocations, please do dive right on in.
I'll jump really quickly into the final question, that yes, faith communities are still very much so sites of surveillance, especially for our Muslim brothers and sisters, with the Countering Violent Extremism program the FBI has and the Department of Homeland Security has. Definitely sites of surveillance for concerns about domestic extremism being birthed in these places is the excuse that is used. It's also Black faith communities as well. Black ministers are being used and employed by the FBI for various things, for volunteering information, but also the FBI sees Black faith as a concern. In 2017, this memo that the FBI produced on Black identity extremism cited Black faith as an important aspect of this title and thing that the FBI made up. So yes, Black faith communities are very important spaces as we think about domestic security in this country.
I mean, I think to the university question, it's important to know, I mean, universities are the intellectual arms of the state, and especially since like the National Defense Education Act, which I think was 1950, sometime in the 1950s, where there's these close partnerships between like the State Department and colleges and universities. So surveillance and policing is absolutely part of that. There's a rise of campus police, specifically after, I think, the Kerner Commission report. And so we should be very concerned because most recently, the Biden administration just passed this, or I think it was an executive order. I think it was an executive order whereby conflates basically anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, pro-terrorism, and pro-Palestine activism that is, having the FBI partner with campus police to crack down essentially on what are like pro-Palestinian protests, and this is in addition to the sort of doxing that's been happening. And so I think that the surveillance apparatus, like moments of crisis and of war, are always moments whereby repression is legitimated and is sort of imposed in a heavy-handed way, but then it's also kind of accepted by the populace because of the exigencies of the moment. I think that we're definitely in that time currently. We see it, from Harvard to Cornell, all of these places that this is happening. And so I do think the university is becoming more and more a site of surveillance and repression, not least because students have historically been a sort of kind of militant and active political force. So,
Adam, you have less than a minute.
all I'll say is, as someone who works at university, the possibility of a university for radical struggle is whatever we insist, we allow it to make, we allow it to be, and it will depend on how strong our unions are, our trade unions, our students' unions, our social movements. That will determine how effective these spaces can be for providing some intellectual fuel for the kinds of social movements that the world that we currently live in needs so desperately.
Perfect. And now back to you, Jean.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to our audience for being with us tonight, for being in conversation at this moment in our country and the world. Thank you to the Schomburg for supporting this. Please come back. We're back on December 7th, again, Thursday, December 7th. We're always here, 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. We're online again. For Financing Freedom, Black Women in Economic Self-Determination with Tanisha Ford, Shanette Garrett-Scott, and Crystal Moten. And please be safe, and thank you so much. Good night.
you.